The result of a wonderful collaboration that began with Sarah Miller McCune, founder of Sage Publications and UCSB supporter, offering the library the opportunity to showcase unique books from her personal collection. We were very fortunate to have Professor Swati Chattopadhyay, chair of the Department of History of Art and Architecture here at UCSB, and one of her graduate students, Mira select the books for the exhibition and provide the narrative contextualization that allows us all to understand and gain meaning from these rich illustrations of India drawn by Britishers in the late 18th and early 19th century. This afternoon, Mira will offer some introductory remarks, and Swati will offer a lecture about the ways in which British colonialists during this time period imagined and viewed the Indian landscape and people. Following the talk, you're all invited to view the exhibition down our hall in Special Collections. We're open tonight there till 8 p.m. and the exhibition remains on view through December 15th. Professor Swati Chattopadhyay received her bachelor's in architecture from Jadavpur University in Calcutta, a master's in architecture from the University of Arizona, Tucson, and her PhD in architecture from the University of California, Berkeley. She is the author of, among others, Unlearning the City, Infrastructure in a New Optical Field, Representing Calcutta, Modernity, Nationalism, and the Colonial Uncanny. And she's currently the editor of the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians. She has received grants for her work from the National Science Foundation and the American Institute of Indian Studies, fellowships from the J. Paul Getty Foundation, the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study, Queen Mary University of London, and the Society of Architectural Historians Founders Award. She teaches courses on modern architecture and urbanism, British Empire, and post-colonial and critical theory. Mira is a doctoral candidate in the History of Art and Architecture department. Her dissertation examines the visual economy of the colonial prison in 19th century India. She is the editorial assistant for the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians. In addition to her scholarly work, she has interned with both the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and the Hammer Museum at UCLA. Please join me in welcoming Mira first.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that introduction. I share in welcoming everyone to the library this lovely Tuesday afternoon. I hope you'll have a chance to visit the exhibition and get a sense of some of the works on display. I was so fortunate to participate in the selection of works for this exhibition, and I'd like to provide you with a brief rationale of the selection process, as well as what draws these works to one another. These works all come from the collection of Sarah Miller McCune. Her collection of books on the Indian subcontinent spans 3 centuries. It contains works that narrate early colonial encounters under the governance of the English East India Company, the high days of empire under the auspices of the British Raj, and the shifting political environment of the Indian nationalist movement that inevitably brought British rule to its end in 1947. The works selected for this exhibition are British works that feature predominantly from the early colonial period, when colonists were first beginning to explore and engage with India's people, places, and culture. Their collective grouping fosters a particular kind of historical engagement and frames the reception of these works as objects. These works recall the early moments of colonial encounter between Britain and India. They allude to a complicated process of exchange whereby British or European experiences of a foreign space were represented and translated into material and consumable objects. They demonstrate how the colonial experience was navigated through the production, transmission, circulation, and dissemination of books. These books were crafted and pieced together through the combination of text and image. Images added to and altered the reception of the text. They had a social life outside of it. And yet the marriage of text and image spoke to the veracity of the representation, so that the books produced a landscape, a fiction of colonial India that was circulated as a kind of truth. Thus, I would argue that all of these works on display were critical to shaping the multifaceted view of colonial India. They were consumed both in the colony and the metropole, structuring British feelings and opinions about their colonial endeavor. Also represented here is a collection of British views which illustrate the great diversity of the colonial project itself. British colonists in the 18th and 19th centuries were comprised of men and women with very different occupations and lifestyles, including artists, merchants, soldiers, aristocrats, surveyors, and academics. Some of the authors and artists spent a great deal of time in India, while others conjured it from afar, never stepping foot on Indian soil. The result of such diversity is that we have an archive of different perspectives, informing our understanding of the space of colonial India. For example, works such as Thomas Pennant's Natural History or Robert Orme's Military History take up the subject of India as a territorial space, making detailed studies of the environment of India and in the former, and using maps to know India in the latter. Other works, such as Francois Balthazar-Salvin's Les Hindus, engage with India's diverse population. Such a work purported to know India through the careful visual study and representation of different social classes, costumes, and objects used in India, as if to suggest that by documenting the population and material culture of a place, one can acquire a kind of power over it. The acquisition of knowledge and the link between knowledge and power were key features in the fiction of the colonial project. That interest in knowledge is reflected in the works on display. A History of India, written by none other than James Mill, father to philosopher John Stuart Mill, became the leading text about the history of India's civilization. This text argued that India was in decline, essentially paving the way for the British to justify imperial domination. Also interested in decline, in the theme of decline, was Scottish architectural historian James Fergusson. Fergusson traveled throughout India, making a visual study of major monuments and architectural sites in order to produce a comprehensive collection of Indian architectural history. Fergusson, though captivated with the perceived exoticism of the Indian-built form, nevertheless believed that architecture told a similar story to Mill's. India was a country in decline that required the guiding hands of colonial intervention. The British juxtaposed images of pre-British India in order to British India in order to further emphasize the developmental difference between Indians and their colonial rulers. Francis William Blagden reproduced several aquatine engravings in his brief history of ancient and modern India. An image of the pagoda at Strukramadur is contrasted with a representation of the old courthouse in Calcutta in Blagden's history. The representation of architecture functions as an ontological tool to demonstrate otherness and depict the changing cultural landscape of the colony. A critical undertone is present even in some of the most visually appealing representations. British artists, including Thomas and William Darnell and William Hodges, developed a visual style for representing the Indian landscape known as the Indian picturesque that often featured ruins. These artists, including the amateur artist Charles Forrest Ramus, manufactured an image of India that was meant to be documentary, but in reality catered to an already existing visual paradigm for viewing the landscape. Works of the Indian picturesque also speak to the romantic relationship that developed between early British colonialists and India. The seemingly exotic people and places of India captured British imagination in a creative and productive way. These romantic feelings can be observed in works that engage with the culture of India. British amateur artist Charles Doyley's works grapples with the culture and customs. This illustration documents a young Britisher exploring the Indian languages with a native instructor. He had such an appreciative tone, or even excited tone, about India and its culture and customs, and faded away by the mid-19th century, when fellow British artist and author George Atkinson wrote his satire Curry and Rice, which appraised British colonialism with a certain air of scrutiny. Britishers studying Indian languages lacked serious conviction in his representations and studied the languages with disdain. Their instructors were similarly represented as satirical characters, bereft of any respectable features. Towards the end of the 19th century, the British solidified their holdings and establishing the Raj as the ruling body of India. New technologies such as photography emerged that seemed to promise scientific representation. Samuel Bourne's photographs romanticized the exotic wilderness of India and its historical buildings, and yet characterized it as a place that could be easily exploited and controlled. This late 19th century fabric of representation conjured a vision of India that seemed truthful, despite its connection to the legacy established by the visual and textual realm of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The works I have cited represent only a fraction of the different perspectives on display here today. The McCune collection also includes travel narratives of British women in India and ethnographic case studies. When viewed collectively, we gain a sense of the different ways early British colonialists experienced India and processed it through personal reflection and representation. These works provide a critical window into a period of history that has dramatic consequences even today in how India is perceived on a global stage. In wandering through this exhibition, I hope you will walk away with a better understanding of the great diversity of the colonial project, and as well as the art and culture of the era. And now, without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Swati Chattopadhyay, whose talk entitled Bookscapes, Trading Knowledge in British Colonial India will provide an exciting and provocative look at representations and material objects in the colonial space. Thank you.
Just keep a glass of water on it. I'm going to put this here. Good afternoon. Good to see you all here. And just want to make sure that you understand that Mira did all the work. I did. Okay? And the library staff did all the work, including actually museum people, Mehmet, help. I am merely the idea person here. So I take that opportunity to speak about larger. What I do is locate my research interests in the periphery or the region of what the museum content, the exhibition content is. So I've been looking at the Colonial archive for 2.5 decades at least, and looking at the buildings for much longer. So what I want to do today is talk about what I would call the material culture of reading and connect it with empire and territory. What is the material culture of reading? That's what I want to talk about. And I'm talking about all scales. I'm talking about the scale of the book, what's contained in it, to the scale of collections, libraries, landscapes, regional landscapes. That's some of the images that Mira showed. In other words, I'm trying to get a sense of what it means to be reading, to have books, and books circulating in the colonial era. I'm talking late 18th century, early 19th century. And I'll more or less stay within the sort of the time parameters of the exhibition, which is 1780 to 1880. The time span might seem, well, arbitrary, or such anchors are. However, you should know that it is not before 1780 that one could speak of really British India. I'm talking about political issues, political events. And by 1880, that dominion has been sufficiently consolidated. And from the late 1880s, we speak of, using Hobsbawm's phrase, Eric Hobsbawm's phrase, the age of imperialism. This is the age of high imperialism across the world, where Africa has been taken on a sheet of paper, marked out as a possession of the Europeans. So what we are looking at in this exhibition, or the images of what I'm going to show you, are some of the material artifacts, social relations leading up to that. So I'm connecting the material culture of reading, books, spaces, peoples, with empire and territory. And I'm going to have this lovely drawing produced many, many times by Charles Doyle. Here it is, a munshi. This gentleman is an Arabic teacher, teaching the British officer or civilian English. It was required of British officers to know some aspect of Indian languages, typically Persian or Arabic. Almost never Sanskrit. If they knew Sanskrit because they were interested in it, and there were great Sanskrit scholars in the 18th century, Wilson and others. But it was typically the language of the Mughal Empire that they needed to have some conversancy with, because otherwise they would not know what, in terms of governance, they would not know what they are transporting and transcribing and dealing with. So it's extremely important to know the Indian languages in the late 18th and early 19th century. And of course, it's no surprise that there is a bookshelf. I like that. There is a bookshelf with books. Because when I talk about it later, we have enough information on what bookshelves. I'm interested in what bookshelves those were. Who were producing them? Who were selling them? Where were they keeping it in the house? Because as an architectural historian, it matters to me to know that. How were books read? Was it just, does it matter in this two pieces of paper or where the book is in the house? Who gets to read it? Because these are, as anybody who looks at books and the material culture of books could tell you, is all about correlations. Who has access to what information? So I'm trying to link that with an extremely sophisticated network of people, knowledge. And when I say circuits of production and consumption, I'm talking about where books were produced, how they were put together, how they were exchanged across oceans, shipped loads of books arriving, they're being auctioned. Same set of books, doing their rounds in different stations, as they were called, in India. We have actual information, enormous information about what books were circulated. By looking at, as we'll show you at the end, the gazettes. And all the cities had gazettes. They were the advertisers. There are lots and lots of wills and probate inventories. So we know exactly what book all these people had. It's totally full. So what I'm trying to do is link. I'm trying to do this pointing thing, it doesn't do it. I'm trying to link the issue of print media, and I'm mostly talking of how different artifacts, whether they're images or text, become books that you can, what we understand commonly as books. Okay? Something between the folds of a page has a binding that you can hold and you can transport. Okay? That, the understanding of that, and the way they were read, they were processed, that social process, had tremendously to do with the work of imagination. It's not just that the authors are being imaginative putting these together. It is the books worked as the core of further imagination. And what I would like to do is sort of walk you through what those works of imagination were. And when I say, I'm intentionally using the terms network, circuits, and fields, they're spatial terms. That there are, you can decipher analytically different processes in terms of consumption of books, in terms of appreciation of books. Libraries, before, in the 18th century, they are all private collections. And then comes the great era of 19th century libraries. In Calcutta, in Bombay, in Madras, like everywhere else. So how did things even get selected? Whose collections were these? Some of the people I'll introduce you to had major collections of both paintings and books, and that interests me. But they were collectors, like Sarah Miller McEwen. They were collectors, and they were extremely appreciative of the value. They're talking about the value, exchange value of those things. They were speculative often, who wanted to sell them and leave them for their heirs. If you look at the books and they're beautiful, you know that most of them were not meant to be read on a whim. They required serious strength to even lift. So they are collections in the old-fashioned sense of the term collection. And I want to sort of preface this, and this is for those of you if you're not familiar with British colonial history. I'm locating it within two sets of textual events. One is probably the most famous minute written in 19th century British colonial India, by Thomas Babington Macaulay. He's having an argument. He's the chair of the Council of Education, Board of Education in India. He's having an argument with the Orientalists, the late 18th century scholars of India, who had suggested that a lakh rupees, that's a lot of rupees in 19th century India, be devoted to educating people in Arabic and Sanskrit. Here comes the whole setup. They have been called, in hindsight, utilitarians. Thomas Babington Macaulay being one of them. And with the help and support of Governor General William Bentinck, wrote this famous minute. You know, when we write memos, this is this big memo. And this is how it goes. He's saying that a single shelf of European library is enough for the entire literature of the Arab world and India, all centuries. Nothing. In other words, he thinks all of what India has to offer in terms of learning is absolutely useless. Students, they're talking about Indian subjects, should not be taught in these languages. And more importantly, the government should not be supporting. If they want to do it on their own time, that's fine. The government should not be supporting this education. This had a profound effect on Indian languages. He went even further. This is a, wrong direction. This part of his quote, that we want to produce a class of people who are basically intermediaries between us, the white rulers, and the mass of the governed, is his most famous statement. Here is the middle class is going to be produced. Who are the intermediaries? Look at me. I speak this language because that's what Thomas Babington Macaulay ensured. I do not speak Persian. This is a huge shift in terms of what is knowable within a country, a curriculum. What is more, his language is strong. I would at once stop the printing of Arabic and Sanskrit books. I would abolish the madrasa and the Sanskrit College of Calcutta, because these are venerable institutions. And he said, the famous place of Hindu learning is Benares. Let it happen in Benares if you want to. Arabic, it's Delhi. Let it happen in Delhi. There's absolutely no reason that in the new presidency towns of Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, the British colonial towns, this kind of knowledge ought to be supported. Because, what do they contain? They contain absurd history, absurd metaphysics, absurd physics, even absurd theology. This is 1835. It entirely changed the landscape of languages in India. This was also the great age of what we call the long Enlightenment legacy of classification and separation. So you have to figure out, the landscape of Indian languages and make room for them in a precise ranking order, over which English would prevail. English would become the medium of instruction. More important than that, English would become the medium of language, the language of governance. So if you had to have a government job, you had to learn English. It was not an option. So this wonderful Munshi teaching the European gentleman Arabic becomes a thing of the past. Which is not to say some Britishers didn't learn it. Everybody still, in England, still taught those languages and they encouraged it. But it mostly became a matter of imperative. It's sort of the way my daughter understands Bengali. All the imperatives she understands. Ask her something really about the language, she couldn't tell me. Okay? Because that's easy to convey. language of command. That's how Bernard Cohn described it. This is the second one, which is the 1880s. Henry Yu put together a glossary of Anglo-Indian words. I love the idea of glossary. And I've been asking my medievalist colleagues, when did the glossary start? Well, it apparently started many years, long time ago. I'm a modernist, so for me this is really reaching. Glossaries become extremely important when languages are confronting each other, when powers confronting each other. When you have cultural conflict, they are shorthand means of translation. You really don't need to understand an entire language to get a sense of the culture. You just need a set of terms. How do we know this? In every area of studies, in books, at the end, there is this thing called a glossary. So, you who need not know Persian will understand the Persian history because you have been given that shorthand. Shorthand is sufficient. But Henry Yu, and it's actually, we have Hobson Jobson in the library, you should check it out. And it's been reprinted many times. It's a wonderful thing. What it does is collect what is Anglo-Indian terms. Terms, as he says, which are in use in everyday life, quotidian, not the language of administration. Of course, then he includes lots of language of administration. What is even more fun for us is that there is a recognition that the terms are misunderstood. Because these people, he's thinking about Europeans, Englishmen, and women. He's thinking that they really don't know what these terms mean, they just use it. Because they have such cursory understanding of the language. And I'm primarily speaking of Hindi Urdu. But he also, the glossary also has lots of southern Indian languages, terms that comes from the south, from the west. He's very aware of this larger, what he calls the field. And he's also cognizant that it is not merely the British coming to India necessitates this. There's a long history of words moving between continents. And he cites this a beautiful passage in his preface, where he talks about this. For me, we should ask, what does Hobson Jobson mean? Right? Because it's not, well, during colonial history, we always knew there's a Hobson Jobson. Glossaries from the late 18th century onwards, there are plenty of glossaries in colonial India. The most important ones are revenue glossaries. There's a famous one in the early 19th centuries from the Fifth Report. Glossaries attached to government reports. Okay? Because there are, in this case, it was terribly important because almost the entire revenue structure was lifted out of local governments. So the terms in use were Persian, or Turkish, or Hindi Urdu, which they needed to know something about to handle basic issues of revenue. Where does Hobson Jobson come from? It says this is the entry against Hobson Jobson. A native festal excitement, or tamasha. Explaining, tamasha is actually fun. And see what comes after that. It comes from the wailing at Muharram, saying Ya Hassan, Ya Hassan. This is the processions which are very, very popular in India. Tamasha? No. It is a sad event being celebrated. The loss. This is about basic doctrines of Islam. Not a whole lot of tamasha in it. But in Anglo years, that became Hobson Jobson. That takes a lot to change. In other words, we are not talking about a little shift. We are not merely saying, the boat dinghy. It's dinghy. In Hindi, Urdu, Bengali. In English, you would just say dinghy, right? So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking a major shift. This compilation in the 1880s and got reprinted many, many times in the 20th century tells you that unlike what Macaulay had said, that he thought, you don't need any of these languages. These languages were not only very useful, they were used all the time. So here is a recognition of a different kind of language competence that is necessary to even do basic things. Forget governance. How about finding a cup of tea? How about the imperatives, ordering your bearer? So with these two sort of time-post textual events, I want to talk about the relations that images forge with texts in what I'm calling this bookscape. The feels, the connections between the book, the image, the text, and territory. I'm talking about actual physical territory. The connection, and this is where the Conjuring part comes in, is not merely a matter of documentation that most of historians, whether it's Orme told James Clyde, the Governor General, to order the Surveyor General, James Reynolds, make me a vast map of Bengal. He needs that to support, to write his history of Hindustan. He had never been to India. Actually, he did go to India, sorry. But he doesn't have the material. So he wants to visualize it. Without that, his history doesn't hold. So there's a deep relation between the reading, the collection, and the landscape it forged. Here comes the idea of conjuring. I want to sort of work through it. If you were here in August, you heard me do this part. The idea, the term conjure means many things. To begin with, it means to summon a spirit, to invoke an image, to cause someone to think or feel. So images, texts, were supposed to give flight to the imagination, allow you to imagine what you have never seen, may never experience. In other words, it places, when we use the word conjuring in daily language, we typically think of this, the work of imagination. There's another one. Conjure comes from the medieval conjure, means together, and to swear as an oath. It has this sense of bending together to form a solemn oath. We don't use that word really anymore in that sense, but it carries that meaning. Here we have one of the famous paintings coming out of the death of Tipu Sultan and the kingdom of Mysore coming, the major event in late 18th century India, the kingdom of Mysore falling into the hands of the British. Tipu Sultan was one of the richest, most successful rulers of southern India. He inherited a huge kingdom. Here, that's his body. You don't even see. Here is General Baird standing in this, in some ways stereotypical pose of benediction. He brings freedom. He is the enlightened one. And all the light and play, it's quite, if you know anything about 18th century historical paintings, you know the trope here. What interests me is that this kind of conjuration of an interior of an Indian palace, which has fallen and will now be inhabited by a more enlightened culture, has that sense of solemnness, to invoke a pledge, in this case, of conquest. It also means, conjure also means to imagine, but also to contrive. Here we are talking about issues of truth. This is a map of India, 1851. It shows the three in color. The colored lines are three presidencies. The Madras presidency, the Bombay presidency, and the Bengal presidency. Even if you have any cursory understanding of India, you would know that those presidencies could not have been so expensive. Why, you ask? The simple reason is it is not. They were large, independent, still independent kingdoms in India at that time. So the Madras presidency is kind of here. It still has to exclude Hyderabad, never fell. They came into an uneasy political alliance. And the British totally controlled everything, but it was not within the Madras presidency. It could not be. Same thing with this whole area of Rajputana. It was not technically part of Bengal presidency. But it doesn't stop the map maker from claiming territory. Maps, we know, are, what's the term I'm looking for? Perpetually unreliable. They are not truthful, whatever they are. And we'll look at map a little more as visual text. To conjure also means to conspire, to make up. That is to conjure up. And here we have, it's another very well-known painting, one of the social scenes from the late 18th century, done by John Zoffany. Here is Antoine Polier with his friends. This is a powerful group in Lucknow at the late 18th century. The painter is in the center. He is who makes this happen. There are paintings of landscapes, historical events. This is Claude Martin. This is Claude Martin's garden house being built. So it's an architectural drawing. Here is the gardener brought in the fruits of the garden, literally representing territory. I mean, it's fairly literal. You don't need to do any sort of gymnastics about what the meanings are here. This is a close group of powerful men in the independent kingdom of Audh or Awadh. They are collectors. They are friends. And they are very pally with the Nawab of Awadh. A couple of Nawabs of Awadh. The most important big, Asaf ad-Daula. Asaf ad-Daula himself was a famed collector. These are, what are they collecting? They're collecting Mughal manuscripts. They're spending enormous amount of money on these beautiful Mughal manuscripts. They want it, and Natasha Eaton will be visiting the campus in January. Writes very nicely about the relation between Hastings, the Governor General of Bengal, of British India, and the collectors. He himself was a collector. He wanted certain paintings, and how did he get them? What exchanged hands? All the British residents in these independent kingdoms, like Audh, were given the task of collecting precious manuscripts because they were valuable more than sense of I just loved them. They had actual monetary value. Audh is, if you, I'm not sure if you can see, that's a little touch of kingdom there. Asafadullah being a collector, big patron of art, so were the Englishmen who surrounded him. This is one of the most important paintings that came out of that time. It is Colonel Mordaunt's, or Mordaunt, the Brits said Mordaunt, cockmatch. It is a social scene. There are actually many, many cockmatches. There are actually written descriptions of these. Why is this a big deal? Cockmatches actually were very popular at that time, both in England and in India. It shows, if you can keep this stable, here is the Colonel, and here is Asafadullah. There were many iterations done of this movie. So when we look at the next ones, you recognize that the cast of characters kind of change with their own cocks and lots of So it was done as a painting initially, as a social scene. When it was reproduced, it was actually used as sort of to mark the social register, because they were produced with these descriptive, sort of the annotations. Who is who? Because it's an important who is who scene. So we actually know that this is Mr. Gregory, this is Mr. Orr. There are the two painters there, Ozias Humphrey and John Zoffany. Here, a colonel is parlaying in terms of leisure, not governance, parlaying equally with the Nawab, extremely rich Nawab above. This is an illustration of power and the exchange of power. The Asherick version of this gets rid of some of these cast of characters and becomes a more, I don't want to go into too much into details of what's exactly happening inside, because my goal here is to relate the frame, the content, to what's happening outside. What is important here, however, is that a scene, like a stage, opens up at the back. This is the stage of empire. The stage is set. There were many other depictions of cockfights in Lucknow. One of them, by an Indian artist, portrays Asafadullah and the colonel in very different visual medium. Entirely different. The setting is different. This is a much more personal, it's not such a public event. Really, the only way we know that he's the Nawab is because there's an umbrella over his head. Otherwise, you need to know, you need an in to even figure out what the heck is happening here. And this is where I want to bring in the other sense of conjuring which we get from Vicente Rafael, who used the phrase, in his book, Promise of the Foreign, to bring the foreign to lodge in the familiar. That's what the act of conjuration does. And that's what, for me, is ultimately the most important point of departure in this exhibition and in the material that I'm looking at. Collections, paintings, illuminated manuscripts of the 18th century were valuable, extremely valuable, but they have a very long history. And that history is, those who study medieval, late medieval, and early modern India would know, you could trace it right from the beginning of the Mughal Empire to the end of the Mughal Empire. And the Mughal Empire in the 18th century is not officially ended yet. It will, by the 19th century. And all the emperors had their own workshop stroke libraries. Problem is, we know a lot about the workshops, the artists, etc. But we do not know what these libraries actually looked like. They were all personal libraries. I've never seen a plan. I would die for a plan of Akbar's library. We know that one of the other Mughal emperors, Humayun, actually fell down from the, while reading a book presumably, from steps of his library. We do not know exactly how his library was organized. We do know how libraries, these manuscripts in temples, were organized. Jain temples and Hindu temples. But not private collections. So there's a great little lag of information between the 18th century and then to the 19th century. Prints, visual images moving back and forth between Europe and India has been happening for way too long. And there are some interesting transformations. So Aurangzeb on horseback, there are many, many images of Aurangzeb on horseback, and they look like, if you didn't know them, they look like Humayun on horseback, because you don't know the difference. You need to know the details of that. So in the European version of that, here is Aurangzeb, and there are, images of Aurangzeb, the side portraits, without not being on horseback. The back is populated with this imaginary, so-called Chinese scene. Why Aurangzeb and China? I have not read a good explanation of why. But it is clearly to set an exotic Eastern context. The issue is not authenticity here. The issue is effect. The issue is creating a vision of a sort of believable landscape, even if it is fantasy. Now, this one, you can, it's not a huge move. This one is earlier, 14th century. This is apparently Devadasis in Coromandel. And this is based on Marco Polo's descriptions. The painter hasn't seen India at all. And even if you don't know anything about Devadasis of Coromandel, you ought to know that they don't look like Indian clothes, Indian whatever. None of the symptomatics are Indian, so to speak. They are somewhere between nuns, because they're called nuns. And what they thought was the ritual of putting an idol on a kind of a platform. This must be what it looked like. So that we can agree, I think, is conjuring, right? Making up. Because you don't have information, you want to create a visual effect. This one, you would say, is not, well, it looks like, a wealthy gentleman being entertained to a dance. Is this conjuring? Looks fairly, detailed. Not a rhetorical question, as I would tell my students, not a rhetorical question. Does this look like conjuring? Like making up? The last one we can I think agree on that it's totally made up. This one, I want you to think about it. Because this gentleman is actually this gentleman. It is Antoine Collier, who had Indian wives, mentioned an Indian household, but he left for Europe when he was done with Lucknow. So this is his household. So the line between depicting authentically and conjuring is very thin when we are looking at these. In terms of representations, paintings, surveys, landscapes were far more intimately connected in the colonial terrain than it could be anywhere else. Because most of the topographical paintings and surveys were done initially for reconnaissance. They were for military purposes. So in other words, there's no view, no vantage in 18th century India to describe, despite George Chinnery's pose of the artist who produces the Indian landscape, that is somehow unconnected to conquest. We'll see what happens when we talk about this and translating image text from one form to another. This is the kind of translations we're talking about. Field book. For surveys, surveyors have field books. They, this is a route survey. Colebrook is marking this route, and he habitually drew. Most of the surveyors, not lots, most of the surveyors were actually quite good amateur artists. That's why they went into surveying. They liked it. Now, James Rennell, the father of British geography, who honed his skills, I mean, the only place where he practiced was colonial India, mid-18th century, did detailed surveys of the Ganges River, from a delta onwards. That's in 1760. This is produced in the second decade of the 19th century. This is Morrison's survey. This is the delta of the Sundarbans. Here are the stream tracks, water tracks, and this is what you see in space, supposed to be jungles. It's a map. What's your estimation? You know, how accurate do you think that is? Apart from, it's not like Morrison is trying to fudge over something. It's really trying to be, really deceitful. He's trying his best. But the problem with the Gangetic Plains is that the water courses moved, changed every season. So Reynolds' famous thing was that you could map it every 5 months, you will never get an accurate map. So this is what, they never got out of the boat. So all of this, what you see, is just an impression of the jungles. It cannot ever be correct, so to speak. James Ferguson, 3 decades later, the person who wrote most of the history of architecture in 19th century India, came up with a different scheme of how to represent the landscape as geography. He knew that rivers moved. So this is, all the red lines are showing the changed course of rivers. He's getting this published in a journal. He doesn't have accurate information, he'll never have accurate information. So what does he do? He just leaps to abstraction. Because Sirajganj, which is about here, he notes that it could be, it is kind of somewhere there. It cannot be exactly where it is marked. It is impossible, because he really cannot say. So what does he do? He produces a theoretical plan of how the river works, how streams operate in the deltaic Gangetic Plains. So there are leaps between the field survey, the journal, the field book, the learned society journal, and then James Rennell did a different kind of abstraction. He was worried that he was making these vast maps, huge maps, because he was trying to maintain scale. That they're actually unusable for most, except for military purposes. What do ordinary people do? If they have to kind of carry them on horseback, in palanquins, where the small space, on boats. So he came up with a table of roads. Now, books of roads, or book of roads, were not unusual in 18th century Britain. What he did for India, however, as a travel guide, is devise a book, a set of instructions of how distance could be calculated by setting up a tabulation. And he has to mark where centers are. What he did was actually produced centers. The prime center was Calcutta. Why? Because that has to be some kind of a firm point from which you can measure distances. In other words, there had to be some kind of discrepancy between the landscape as experienced and the landscape which can be studied, understood, if comprehension is the logic, and usefulness is the logic. Since topographical paintings were highly popular, whether they were rural scenes or city scenes like this one, and when they're populated with figures, we know that it looks like there must have been there, or some kind of simulating the sense of the busyness of the street. The Daniels drew their figures from the servants that traveled with them. So they were not, however, specific people. They were leading to types that he could use to populate the scene. A very different sort of set of appreciation for groups. We're going to talk about representing people as groups, as ethnographic descriptions, as will become very popular in the mid-19th century, from something like this, which actually shows in extreme detail, something tries to bring out the personalities of the people populating the paintings. So the idea that no matter what you draw, whether you are remembering it, whether you're on site, yet got transferred to magazines and journals, they became typified. So an extremely heterogeneous experience got reduced, abstracted to a few types. Leading in the mid-19th century to a massive collection, the people of India. This is a long process of the 18th century. And because different people, amateurs, with or without public support or government help, had taken on to describe different types of people. What this version of Forbes and Kay's People of India did, it was supported by the government as a survey. So those little depictions, individual things got pulled together in a big volume, which became the authentic source for understanding castes, groups, tribes. The image that I began this talk with, and with something that Mira referred to, this is drawn from one of Charles Doyle. This is one of Charles Doyle's sketches, then produced as aquarelles, which of course goes through multiple changes in form, from drawing to sketch to engraving and then to coloring. The one that's on display here is actually one particular edition and set of relations that this gentleman, Williamson, brought out. What is that? He is putting together some introductory text next to 20 of these images. And they're all about master-servant relation. All. The 1813 version actually also had William Blagden's History of India. So these 20 aquatins were used for different editions with different names, took different book forms, and produced different content. And in this one, the ones on view, he's clear. He wanted to be for not just useful as kind of a guidebook, because that's what he's creating. He's taking these individual paintings and producing a guidebook, a travel guide. And he wanted that to be useful as well as amusing. Suddenly, these individual drawings done over a period of time get put together as a serious content and a guide for travelers and residents. Instead of that, it could be amusing, and you have to really look at it to figure out which is the amusing part. George Atkinson's Curry and Rice on 40 plates, he says it's pungent, because curry is pungent. He is caricaturing, as Mira pointed out, both the British and the Indians. What interests me is not only what's happening inside, but how they got used. Steele and Grace Gardiner bring out their authentic housekeeping guide, household guide and cookbook. They did not use the images. But this one, the 20th century version, pulls that image from Atkinson and puts it as a marker of the time. Florani Steele's version of keeping home in India was extremely authoritative. It was an authoritative version of this is what you do, and this is what you don't do. What we often forget is that she also wrote novels. So they are both drawn upon, relies on her own very personal experience in India as a wife of a very senior civilian. I want to end with the set that has brought me into this sort of world, what I could call Bookscapes, is the gazettes and gazetteers. Gazettes are still produced in every district, often cities. In the 18th century, they were also called general advertisers. And the official one competed with James Hickey's, or William Hickey's. And William Hickey's was completely kind of a scandal-mongering newsprint news magazine. And here, the government comes in and says, we're going to do something more useful. So it had all the proclamations, all the property transactions that had to be, properties that were auctioned off by the government, all that stuff. But it also had, and this is where the fun stuff I find, advertisements, lots of advertisements. When I first started doing my research on houses, this was my go-to source. If I wanted to understand how a property has changed hands from one time to another, because you almost always advertised in the Calcutta Gazette. What is lovely about this advertisement of the house is that, look at that little drawing there, little, It's nothing like what you would find in Calcutta or India. It is a little British townhouse. Something that is being reproduced there because they have clearly the already done, the visual segment. So what the gazetteers did was bring in information and visual content from very disparate sources and put them next to each other. But it also created what I would call the social landscape. Nothing is better than looking at a gazetteer, the Calcutta Gazette or the Bombay Gazette, to know what these people read and how the pieces of the social puzzle were connected. So much so, already by 1869, Stephen Kerr decided to do a selections from the late 18th and early 19th century Calcutta Gazettes. His reason? You get a social description of early colonial life like you would never do. So the gazettes in book form, which the University of California owns, becomes the sort of endeavor where you can see text content, visual content, being conjoined in peculiar ways, unpredictable ways, and also something that you can think of as a little ember starting another, start populating another. What I did not, of course, go into, in response to Macaulay's one shelf is good enough, of European books is good enough for the entire literature of Arabia and India, is that what the Indian nationalists would do from the mid-19th century onwards as a challenge to the European, or rather colonial, reading and publication practices. They would launch an entirely new bookscape. And that kept, and Benedict Anderson was right, novels as the core of redefining the landscape. Thank you. I'm told I have to take some questions.
Yeah, there's some time for questions if anyone has any about the exhibit or the talks today.
Yeah, I was just curious. I recently read a commentary on Punjabi poetry. Now, is Punjabi Hindu?
You know, Punjabi can be both Hindu and Sikh, depending on the language. Doesn't, you know, the person sitting next to you should be able to tell you. Shalini is native Punjabi, but the point is that it cannot be marked in terms of religion, really. Okay, so the language, just like Bengali, it can be Hindu or Muslim, it doesn't matter, because it's a regional language.
So was where that language existed, how much of the empire was in that area, or how did?
I could go back and show you where it was. It's in northwestern. It was part of the northwestern provinces, which was not part of the presidencies. And it was considered a frontier area because Punjab is between, you know, what is North India and what is Afghanistan and Kashmir. Okay, so all Punjab included Kashmir. Okay. So Punjab had a special reputation for warring tribes, and there is a wonderful piece on the Sikh wars that is on display. It became the epitome of the martial tribes in India, as opposed to the people of the eastern and southern who were just, the term was effeminate. They were not masculine enough. So Punjab was brought up as the epitome of. So a particular narrative of, in terms of the landscape, the kingdoms, and the histories got produced. And it's actually, the example that's here is pretty good. While I show that location, any other questions? Yeah.
Maybe you hinted at this, but was there actual competition for the Mughal manuscripts between the Europeans and the locals?
Oh yeah.
So is that maybe a trope of the cockfighting? Is like we're kind of.
It is. But the cockfighting is it touches on other levels as well because it was deeply political as well. Right. But part of it was this extreme competition between the Britishers and the remaining Nawabs and elite, because traditionally, at least from the Mughal dynasty, starting with Babur, when you had they all had their workshops and ateliers and libraries. They produced these wonderful works, and they spent enormous money also buying from other regions. Because mind you, they're not just producing them. So, for example, if they want a 8th century, West Indian Hindu rock piece, they would buy that. They would pay an enormous money to some temple to get that. Okay, so the competition was already existing because to be educated in the literary sense was the epitome of culture. So all the nobles, they were expected to participate. All the nobles were expected to have their own workshops. Delhi, for example, was set up like that. The entire neighborhoods of Delhi were set up like that. That you would have your own workshop. Okay? You would foster these kind of things. So when the Brits come in, or Europeans, not just the British, they come in, they are participating in an already extremely valuable market. And by that time already, European prints coming to India were, it was already a thing of the past. Nothing new. So that's why you see these wonderful combinations of the responses in Mughal painting of responding to, let's say, Henry VIII or Queen Elizabeth in terms of territory, in terms of what is possession and who is king of the world. And also, mind you, competing with the Safavids, particularly, and the Ottomans. The Mughal, Safavids, and Ottomans, they had a kind of a network of artists that had shared, and extreme competition in collecting pictorial and also not just pictorial, also texts it could be a lot of things. It could be poetry, it could be the epics. So the British, and they did it very effectively. One of the things, this is where the well-documented scene is actually Lucknow, where the Lucknow and actually Hyderabad, where part of the monies that had to be paid, they were basically bribes, were simply those kinds of manuscripts, which immediately went back to Europe. The question is, whether it is Mughal manuscripts, whether it's Calicut paintings of late 19th century Calcutta, the best collections are in Europe or in the US. And there is a long history of that happening. So I don't know whether that answers.
So you're talking about Sanskrit as well?
Oh yeah, Sanskrit texts were, written, some of them were more precious than others depending on the lineage, depending on where the temple, it was not even the, the sort of materiality of the text. What is the lineage of who hosted it before, right? So for example, the Jains were very, until into the 20th century, very particular about holding onto their manuscripts. And we have good descriptions of, actually, library historians have done very good work on where they were kept. That's the best descriptions we have of the conditions. That's why I said there's a huge sort of missing element in terms of what my bookscape is, how that kind of culture gets attuned to what we would all, expect in the late 19th century libraries, right? And even I have to say, even in the European stuff has just been worked properly. Yes.
You mentioned that there would be a later pushback with Indian writers creating their own sort of fictional bookscape. Was that ever seen as a valuable luxury good in the same way that Mughal manuscripts were, or?
No, they were not valuable, okay, in that sense. But they're extremely effective. Their value was different in terms of it is happening from the 1860s onwards. So print culture has become much more, prolific. There were, by the 1890s, I forget the exact number, there is a book, there's an edited volume called Texts of Power by Parker Chattopadhyay, because there's an article on those presses, etc. There were literally hundreds of presses. And I'm just talking about one city. Okay? There were hundreds of presses printing both in terms of woodcuts, visual material, and all kinds of plays, novels, satirical stuff were extremely popular. And also, as a result, 1885 comes the Vernacular Press Act, which says can't print everything because most of them were seditious. So it was the Vernacular Press Act. So things in English was okay. It doesn't matter who wrote it. So, yeah.
Actually, the photography first came to India in 1850. The British sent a photographer and cartographer here. And those photographers took excellent pictures of ancient Vedic temples, Hindu temples, which are in ruins, or most of them are gone now. And I belong to an organization. They are restoring those pictures. They have got those beautiful archives, and they have excellent collection of pictures from 1850, 1860 era from the British. And we have gotten them from all the auction houses and museums, and the head of the organization is interpreting them, all the architecture and the values. So I'm really interested in talking about them and looking at
the British Library has a great collection. Interestingly, the Canadian Centre of Architecture. The Canadian Centre of Architecture also got a huge collection of 19th century British photographs.
I'd just like to point out that if your curiosity about the materials in the cases extends beyond what you can see, the special collections staff can pull them out and you can page through them in the reading room.
I've been doing that.
But once the exhibition comes down, they will go back into Sarah Mill and McCune's collection and will not be accessible after that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to